Greetings. Welcome to Baba Nyame. I'm your guide and host, Grace Kunadu. After a 2-week hiatus, we're glad to be back. And so today's episode will focus on what it means to be spiritually lost and found. I'm going to begin with a story. A few days ago, I had one of the most magnificent, exceptional, amazing experience in my entire life of being on this planet. And this was a ritual that was carried out. And in the ritual, I had to perform, certain kinds of tasks. I won't go into the detail because that's not really important. But in the process of the ritual, I remember outside, and it required a number of sacrifices. It required a number of, oils and materials to essentially facilitate the ritual. And so while doing it, I remember, I had looked up at the clouds that had covered the sun. The sun was just out hot, burning hot. And then the clouds covered it. And as I began to pray, to basically say what it is, I was asking for, what I'm pleading for, and making my case to the Almighty, to God, I saw the clouds not only push back and open up, and the sun just shined as bright as ever. But that wasn't even, there was more to it. As I began to go through the steps of the ritual, and it became much more involved, where I had to, include certain kinds of materials, including, pieces of me, in terms of whether it be samples from my hair or other kinds of material, because I was part of the ritual. I was the material for the ritual, and so parts of me had to be sacrificed. And sacrifice, of course, comes from the word meaning to act sacred towards. So my sacred role was to offer a piece of myself in this moment, and offering to whom? Offering to God Almighty. And in doing so, I noticed this. As I began to make the case, for what is it that my heart's desire, and to make sure it's coming purely from my soul, right? And the honesty from my soul, I saw the clouds and the sun turn like a orange, red glow. And I saw a figure in the clouds, and I saw the figure push back, and I saw the figure sort of fade, and then the sun, almost like an eye, was blinking, literally blinking. And as it blinked, it shined so bright. It's like almost a high beam, into your eyes. And what was so amazing was that I saw all of it, and it did not hurt my eyes. Normally, of course, anyone looks directly in the sunlight, you will experience some kind of discomfort or pain from looking directly in the sunlight, but that wasn't the case for me. I saw everything, the transformation of the clouds, the colors, the brightness, the brilliance. And the more God spoke, the more I saw the transformations in the sky and the clouds. And afterwards, God asked me, if I was willing to make this promise to, be his servant. And I said, of course. And I meant it from my heart, and I still mean it, and I will mean it. And of course, it's an honor, when God asks you to serve, because that's what I've been doing most of my life as a healer, but also as a young man that was born into a family of healers. And so this opportunity was not only rare and magnificent, but it was a phenomenon that, I want to share with you all for these reasons. I share that experience with you because it's not the first. It's the first of many. As many of you know who have followed this channel, I've been involved in so many things that I shouldn't be here speaking to you. And it's only because of the presence and because of the grace of the Almighty that I am here. It is not for any particular ancestor or ancestry, not for any particular spiritual entity or force. It is strictly and solely because of Almighty. And I know that as I know my name, and I know that as I know my children, and I know that as I know my wife and those I love. I am certain and have no doubt about that. How am I so certain? Here's why. Some of us believe or think that God the Almighty is not real, that in whatever Africa-based tradition that we may follow, or even non-African tradition we may follow. In those traditions, it is presented, or God is presented often as some distance, aloof, and some imaginary idea or concept. I'm here to tell you that in all my years of practicing as a healer, and before I was formally a healer and under the wing of my grandfather, and he was a healer within the Kumina tradition that's found in Jamaica, that I have never experienced anything like this. I saw the Almighty for myself in broad daylight. It was about 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, as bright and brilliant as ever. Now, yes, I've seen the Almighty in my dreams. I've seen it, sort of in my waking state, but never like this. And the wonderful feeling that I had, I was light. I was almost giddy like a child. That's how it made me feel inside. And that is a very important thing for this reason, my friends. You see, the Creator asks of us to always have the spirit of a child. I don't mean to act childish. I mean the spirit of a child. The lack of fear, except for the Almighty. The courage, the innocence, the purity. That's what the Creator means by act like a child. And so I felt that childish feeling, bubbling in me. I felt very light. So all those spiritual forces and baggage that was burdening me down was lifted up off me once I made that particular promise and made that vow, to God in the presence of the Almighty. And it was, it was wonderful. It's like seeing a solar eclipse, or seeing some other celestial phenomenon that comes only once in a while, and it's like just tremendous, like you can't even believe it's happening. It was like that, you all. And I wish you were there to experience it. But I've experienced much more, and I share this with you for this reason. Because at one point, I was spiritually lost. Yes, yours truly was. Now, yes, it is true I was born into a family of his, and it's true that as a child, I was very powerful. I could see things. I could hear things. I know if I visualized it, it would happen in real time and in a real way, materially, physically, real. And so something happened along the way. By 18, I had the idea that I wanted to be embraced more, being African, which was always with me, innately anyway. But I wanted to embrace that with the people that I was around. And that led me down a particular path where I decided to change my name legally, of course, after asking my parents for permission. And some other changes happened with me during that period that led me down a path where I began to lose my powers that I was born with. The same powers that the Almighty, that God gave me, when I was born, actually gave me in my mother's womb. Those same powers began to diminish. They never went away fully, but they began to become less and less and less the more along that path. And I remember clearly that I wanted to go to this conference, in Washington, D.C. when I was an undergrad. And for some reason, it wouldn't happen. And I was forcing it. It wouldn't happen. Now, years later, I eventually went to the conference. And I met some people there, again, people who were part of these African Centers communities. And I thought that this was, a good environment for me to learn more about, being African, and so on. Now, in my naivete, I became lost in other people's idea of being African. And I forgot my own indigenous, my own local ideas of being African from Jamaica, because Jamaica is little Africa, or Africa bottled in an island. And anyone who travels to Jamaica, spend time in Jamaica, will know what I'm talking about, or at least has some experience, spending some time in Jamaica, will know what I'm talking about. From the Maroonage to the Kumina to the Pokominia to the Congo traditions to, which is Kumina and others, to the various Akan-based traditions, to other West Central African traditions that are ripe here. There are villages that still speak fluent Yoruba in the western part of the island. So there's so much of Africa that is here that I began to forget. And around the same time, as some of you may remember, I was without my grandfather. My sister had passed away 11 months when I was younger. My mom, had this horrific, fire accident. She, experienced certain kinds of ill spiritual treatment from other people that made her into a person that was not she. And so the people that I loved and loved me began to leave very early, and I became very angry at God for why that God took away these people I love so much. And in doing so, that anger bubbled into when I became 19. And that's when it began to change, because at that point I had a strong internal feeling and inside of me, driving me to reconnect with my father. Now I thought that was my earthly father. Come to find out years later, months later, that it was in fact, my celestial father. And so that confusion came about because I began to lose my power since a young boy. I lost my grandfather, who was my guide, into me and who I was to become. I lost my mother, for all intents and purposes, though her shell, her body was still here. Her spirit was not here anymore. Lost my sister. And the loss began to compound. And anyone who has lost a loved one know what I'm talking about. You are never the same. It's like going to war. You're never the same. You're always transformed by the trauma of war. The same is true for the trauma of loss. So I began to essentially hold God accountable, for that. So much so that once I started to have children, I taught my two daughters wrongfully, never to speak the word God in the household, never to talk of God and so on. And really, it was the pain and bitterness of loss that led me to essentially forsake God the Almighty, because I was never hateful of God, right? So whether it's my prayers or libation, I would always, of course, invoke God, but it was almost like an idea. It was almost like just a concept. It was never real, right? And so the experience that I had a few days ago was real. It's like in the past 3 years, what I've had, what I've learned, directly speaking to God, being spoken to, and being spoken through others, whom are around me and who have the capacity, the spiritual capacity to hold a portion of God in them for the purpose of communication, have taught me so much, not just about myself, but about this world. And so during that ritual, it reminded me also that everything that I've learned over the years since I was 18 and began studying, seriously, I was living in the library. The library was my best friend as an undergraduate. I lived in the library. I read voraciously. But I began to study a lot of traditions. I began to study not only African and African-based traditions. I began to study, the Rig Veda, which of course is the sort of textual basis for Hinduism. I began to study Shintoism, the religion in China. I began to study the indigenous people of the Americas, sort of the First Nations in the Americas and their traditions. I began to study indigenous people in Europe. Yes, there are indigenous people in Europe. People who believe in spirits, who believe in little figures referred to as leprechauns, which in Tree or common people referred to as mutia, little people, that is, or little creatures. I began to study, the people across Asia, of course, Afro-Asia is African Asia, and really, thinking about these traditions in terms of okay, what are these creation narratives? What are these stories? What are these parables teaching me about creation and about the world and about existence, right? Those are sort of my philosophical questions that I was wrestling with. Of course, I remember I bought my first Quran when I was 18. I began to read it. I began to read the Bible. I began to read, all different kinds of texts and different kinds of philosophies, different kinds of stories. I began to read Confucianism, I began to read Buddhism. I read widely. I continued over the years. Fast forward, at age 50, I can tell you that all of that study was for a reason, was for a purpose, right? And that's why I know that God is not only real, that God makes no mistakes. All the things that I had been studying and I had been practicing, I've been learning from, even my missteps and mistakes, even my folly of following other people's idea of what African was, led me to this moment where I began to reread these things with open eyes. You see, when we are enslaved to dogma or enslaved to somebody's idea of what you think you should be doing, you can't see clearly. It's only when you remove yourself from that, or you are removed by the Almighty, and the Almighty have done that for me, and I know that without a doubt, without a question, I began to see more clearly. So I'm going back to these texts that I'm reading. I'm going back, to, for example, I'm reading Genesis, which is the first book of Moses. I'm reading Genesis, of course, and of course, this is the first book of Moses. And Moses, of course, as many of Africans and scholars have told before me, but I'll remind you of those who haven't read them as yet, or don't remember them, that many Africans and scholars, John Henry Clark, Joseph Ben Yakin, and others have already pointed out, J. Carruthers, that Moses, in fact, had spent 40 years or more, 4 decades, living, as a royal, in the high court in ancient Egypt or Kemet. But at that point, it wasn't the ancient Egypt or Kemet that we often fantasize about. This was ancient Egypt under Greek rule, under a line of rulers referred as Ptolemy, spelled with a P. And so the Ptolemy line of Greek or Grecian rulers who, in fact, had conquered ancient Egypt after the Persians. And of course, after the Greeks, the Romans would take over, and of course, the Arabs would take over. And so it's no longer Kemet. Yes, there are African people there in the populace, or the wider population, but it's no longer Kemet. And so Moses, he is in fact, an African who is there in that moment. And how we know this? We know this because, not simply because this is a historical figure. Now, granted, something doesn't have to be historical in order for it to be real and possibly happen. And so we know from all the textual evidence that we have, as well as other kinds of evidence, that linguistic evidence as well, that Moses, the name itself, formed part of many of the rulers and high ruling figures in ancient Kemet, right? Such as the notion of Tuthmos, right? Or Mose, that is Moses or Mose, referred to of God. Right? And so Moses, in fact, has not only spent these years, but was in fact, as some have argued, was perhaps maybe, a spiritual leader of high regard. And it's no surprise that it was Moses that God chose to reveal certain kinds of important messages and guidelines for living righteously because of the unrighteous living that was occurring under Greek rule in ancient Egypt. And so Moses is given, as we all know, these commandments. But more than that, he was given essentially another version of earlier versions of creation stories, right? Which, of course, we find in Genesis. He's also given other books that we find, essentially stories, narratives. And he is informed of to take the people of God, out of Egypt under Greek rule. Who were those people? Those people were African people who had not forgotten, God, who had not forgotten the Almighty, which of course the Grecian rulers had no, business with, because, they were into these orgies and parties and a life of opulence and all kinds of draconian or harsh rule. They were not concerned with God or the Almighty, but many of the populace, they were in fact. And so Moses was chosen by the Almighty to lead the people out of that, that is, lead the people of God who in fact want nothing to do with the lifestyle and the views and values of the Grecian rulers. And so rereading, Genesis, just really had reminded me that all that I had learned about African history, ancient African history, and I have to give a shout out to this elder named Nana Bafor, who taught me Medu Neter, which the Greeks refer to as hieroglyphics. He taught me Medu Neter when I was an undergrad. I used to go to his house in Harlem on the weekends every Saturday, and he would teach me. In fact, he had a computer program called Inscribe, and it would actually had all the characters, and he would teach me how to not only write, but also to read the Medu Neter. So I was a serious student, folks. Serious, still am, but I was a serious student. And so I took this very seriously, and I realized that all that training, all that on my own, all that learning, was for a purpose. And so as I sit here before you and share this with you, it also began to make sense to me that even in the story of Adam and Eve, we're talking about parable, not literal. See, many people read these texts and they read them literally. They read them either as historical content or they read them as literary content. It's neither. It's myth, but myth doesn't have to be untrue. It's symbolic. And so the ancients understood this. They spoke and wrote in metaphysics. We read and speak in literal, right? And so the literal will never get you to the metaphysics or the meaning behind symbolic language, right? Which is how many African cultures code their sayings in proverbs or parables, because this is the way in which the wise communicate in proverbs and parables, in coded language, right? And so in rereading the story of Adam and Eve, you realize that, first of all, Adam and Eve very much mirrors the story of among the Kikuyu people in East Africa, in Kenya and neighboring countries, predominantly in Kenya, where the first couple was in fact Kikuyu and Mumbi. that was created by the creator, which in Gikuyu, the language, is referred to by several names, as we know. Many cultures have different names or different adjective phrases for God and the creative force. So I'll give you one, which is Mukuyu. So Mukuyu had essentially created the first couple, Gikuyu, the male, and Mumbi, the female. And there was what? A tree of life. Of course, we found out in Genesis, in the first book of Moses, there is, of course, Adam and Eve. Again, archetypes, not necessarily historical figures, but archetypical figures, just like Gikuyu and Mumbi. And in fact, there's a tree of life that's there. The same is true in ancient Kemet. The original couple, of course, being what the Greeks call Isis and Osiris, which, of course, in the Kemetic language referred to as Oset and Osar. And there, too, there are bas relief or imageries, on the walls of the pyramids as well as the papyri, that you have a tree of life and a serpent, right? And so these symbols and the narrative created around them speak to the same language, speak to the same God, speak to the same creative force and Almighty. And the ability to be able to read and to see these common threads, but also to read and tease out what is the unifying force, what is the unifying factor, what is the unifying story here for all of us. It all was based on all those years of study. And so after 30 years, I can comfortably sit and say that once you understand that God is real, God is one, God is everywhere and everything that is of God, you will know that there are forces, there are people, there are entities that are not of God, right? And you might say, well, Kwesi, that seems silly, that seems confusing. Well, let me explain this way. You can give birth to children, 5, 6, 7, 10, 12, and they all, though they come from you, they won't remain of you. That is, some will become thieves, murderers, robbers, and you may be a righteous person. Now, are they not your children? Yes. But what they have become is not of you. The same is true for God. Yes, God is responsible for all creation, but not all creation is of God. And I learned that the hard way by following certain ancestral forces and figures, by following certain spiritual forces and figures that I was told were African. And so I followed naively, and that was my period of being lost. Having been found, I no longer am deceived or mystified by that, because everything now is clear. My eyes are like wide open. My heart and soul is settled, is steady, is golden, and my path is illuminated. And that's what it feels like to be found, right? Being found is not some, retreat you go on and you meditate and you practice a yoga position. I'm not trying to ridicule or belittle, what people who do that. That's well and good, I'm sure. But I'm using it to make a very important point, which is that people think finding yourself is doing that and doing that alone. And what I'm here to share with you is that being spiritually lost and found is as simple as praying and praying directly to God. Because the rituals that I did were directly to God. In my earlier experiences, I was informed that God is too distant. He doesn't want anything to do with humans and people. You go through the Busum, you go through this, you go through that, and that's how you do it. And that's untrue. And I'm here to tell you that's untrue, because the sacrifices I did, the burnt offerings that I did, were directly to the Almighty, and they were received. And I saw and I heard, up in the sky, everything, everything. And what I felt, right? No one can tell me otherwise, that God is not real, that God is simply some concept, some distant, aloof, figure, if at all, something in the imagination, right? That is real. And being found is a wonderful feeling. Now, I want to share more with you, about these revelations, about these insights that I'm gaining by going back to those reflective skill sets that I had, honed over the years, and kind of going back to 19-year-old self that essentially, was already on a path as a young boy that was taken off that path for whatever reason to put me through the test. Because remember, the reason we are tested daily, hourly, minutely, secondly, is to make us stronger, is to make us better, is to make us more of who we are, not less. And you may say, well, why put me through a test? You know, you may say, the Almighty God, you know my heart, you know who I am. Yes, that is true. But to make you the better version of you had to be tested. So removing me from a previous marriage, removing me, you know, from people that meant me no good. Because once I resigned from my job, all the people that were emailing and calling me stopped. And that was God doing that to show me that these are people that mean you no good. These are people that are only friend in name. These are people that are only this. These are people that are only family in name. These are people that are only this in name. Nothing more. And I am so thankful. And that's what I mean, my friends, by being found in the broader, elongated sense. So I am now clear about who's in my corner and who's not. And Toni Morrison said this: life is about who has your back and who's going to stab you in your back. It's that simple, right? And I know God has my back and always had my back, even when I was angry and upset because of bitterness and pain. For Kwesi Kunadu, for being lost and found, and for Powered by Nyame, I've been your guide and host. Until next time, please drop your comments and questions below and experiences. Until then, stay well.